Um, one of the questions that we kind of have to lead with this one is, how are you managing calls with COVID and the current situation? Because the way that you and Joe interact is very up and close. You're hugging, you're connecting, you're shaking hands. How is that affecting the work that you're doing now? What does that look like?
Yeah, so a couple of changes have happened since the documentary. I'm working in conjunction with the local mental health authority, so I have a clinician and paramedic assigned to me. And what we've done is we've identified the top 100 most emergency detained or involuntarily committed individuals in the city. And we go out to try to pre-engage the crisis to find out, why do these individuals continue to end up in the hospital? What is that barrier to treatment? And the biggest challenge with COVID is, once they do get hospitalized during the process of us helping them, because it happens, is it's difficult to get into the hospitals to figure out what's going to be a discharge plan. How do we get them into housing? Because a lot of the shelters here are shut down. They're not accepting intake right now. So we have very, very limited resources for housing. And, that's the biggest challenge for me. I'll still go out in the field and contact people. We just have to wear our protective gear, but the resources have really gotten tight here because of COVID.
Thank you. Do you, just as a follow-up to that, how is that program of reaching out to the 100? Are you seeing that as a successful approach?
I am so happy to report, yes. We have been running this program for about a year now. And when we got the list, the average involuntary commitment per person was about 3.2 per a month. So that's a lot of hospitalizations. Now that we've managed these 100 patients, and some of them have even come off the list and we brought on new people because they've done so well, now the average has dropped to 0.92 hospitalizations per month. So that is not only just a huge cost savings to the stakeholders that have invested into this program, they've invested into human beings and treatment. And that's where we have seen the really the outcomes is people are being connected to providers. We're providing the transportation. We have budget for medications. We help them with their ID recovery, which is huge because a lot of the people that are unhoused don't have an ID or a social security card or a birth certificate. So there's a lot of moving parts in this program. And I think it's for sure going to be a national model. Absolutely.
Yeah. Well, it's another way that San Antonio Department is leading on the leading edge. What are your thoughts on sort of the reformation of police practices with mental health and sending non-police units?
Yeah, I think that's fantastic. There's going to be some calls where you're going to have police respond, if the acuity for violence is there, the propensity for violence. But you got to remember, people with mental health really don't want or need the police in their lives. So I think, a change in direction in the way that we respond to them is long overdue. If it's somebody that's just having a difficult time, that's not sure what to do in life, if they don't know what doors are open to them for anxiety or depression, or even their diagnosis, and they're having difficulty, trying to find a provider, it's going to be very difficult for a policeman to show up and say, well, I have the answers to all that, because we really don't. We're very limited in our scope of what we can do. So bringing in the experts, that's what they go to school for, to respond to the community, it makes perfect sense. And I have a clinician ride with me. And a lot of times all I do is just make sure the scene is safe. And then I shut my mouth and get out of the way and let the clinician do her thing or his thing. And it's been a great response that we're having here in San Antonio.
Great. In the movie, you and Joe in particular talk about self-care, and do you see that as an ongoing, maybe cultural thing that's is that changing in the police department in terms of people talking about self-care, preventing burnout, not just for you and Joe as you continue to do your work, but in the department as a whole?
Yeah, so I'm glad you asked that question. I was in California last week over in Pinole, and I was teaching out there. And the chief of police out there actually came up with a model for wellness for the police department, and it's called the Asher model. So if there's any police officers watching this or leadership, just Google the Asher model. And what it does is it's cultivating a wellness, an environment for wellness. And the first thing they want to do is make awareness, number one, of it's okay not to be okay, right? It's okay. It's just not okay to stay that way, because we need to have resources for you. And those resources that we're going to provide are, for example, they use an app on their phone that they purchase called Cortico, and it has therapists available, a wide variety of self-help on there. They do a environment of healthy eating, so they brought in healthy vending machines. They allow the officers to work out on duty, for the first 30 minutes or something of their shift. They provided a quiet room for the dispatchers, the 911 call takers, that on their break, they can go to a quiet room. And they designed it themselves. So, and there's a lot more pillars to this, but that's what they did. They started a culture of wellness and made it very acceptable within the police department. So I'm trying to take that model that Neil Gang came up with and institute that into other departments where I go and teach, because it's a fantastic model. And it's something that, all police departments can benefit from.
Yeah, that's great. That's great that you have that kind of systemic support and access. I mean, even a vending machine with healthy food, that's a great and accessible way for officers to take care of themselves, particularly since Joe mentions his Twizzlers and Skittles. And when he's on later, I'm going to ask him what his snack of choice is these days.
He loves he loves the nastiest stuff, right? Like black licorice, like that will never touch my lips. He will eat it like it's going out of style. Like whenever we order a drink at a drive-through, I'm like, yeah, give me a Coke. He's like, I'll take the high C or something. I'm like, whatever, man.
Well, if he has the metabolism for that, he can go for it.
He does not.
What do you see as the future of CIT in terms of, because it's required as part of the academy, and then it's being required through ongoing continuing education, with the changes in police forces not responding directly to mental health calls? How do you see CIT sort of playing out in the future?
Well, I still think CIT is going to be a huge part in police departments, because the main goal of CIT is to teach de-escalation. So why wouldn't you teach your police officers how to de-escalate a crisis, whether it's mental health related or not? So there's always going to be a place for CIT in policing. Where I do see some gaps in that, and actually it's, I started just like Joe started a training company, I did as well. I've really introduced the concept of social intelligence into training for police officers. Understanding mirroring neurons and body language. I teach a class on procedural justice and implicit biases. So there's a lot of ways that you can strengthen a very good program already, because not every CIT program is identical. Some of them are 16 hours long, some of them are 40 hours long. They just differentiate between department to department. So you really need to have a best practice model that involves, scenario role play and real life based role play models coming in and providing that kind of training to let the officers practice the skill sets that they learned in the classroom, during some role plays. And that if you do it right and you bring in subject matter experts into the training and run a 40-hour course, it can be done.
Yeah, that's great. I'm glad that San Antonio will continue to do that. In the movie, there's the work that you guys are doing with the crisis center. What kind of services do those crisis centers provide? Do they do counseling? Is it just 24-hour observation? Or, as we saw with one gentleman, he was just out for 4 hours, but what are the services available?
So the crisis center is really a one-stop shop. They tailored it for law enforcement. So at the crisis center, they have a 16-bed facility for a 48-hour hold for stabilization and observation. If there's higher acuity, they can transfer. We also have a 20-bed detox location there. So if somebody is intoxicated on the street, instead of taking them to jail, we can bring them in to the sobering unit. And from sobering, they get engaged to actually enter into a detox program free of charge. We also have a minor medical clearance there as well. So if an officer encounters somebody that has an injury that, taking them to jail, they're going to be rejected and then have to go to the hospital at night, we can actually go to the crisis center, and they've got about a 30-minute turnaround to take care of any kind of minor medical, whether it's getting stitches, just cleaning up some cuts and scrapes, and getting that check mark to, okay, it's okay to take your citizen to wherever they need to go next. So not only that, they provide a 24-hour mobile crisis response team. So if a call comes in through the crisis line, they have a 24-hour mobile response. So they do a variety of engagement in the community. And like I said, they made it a one-stop shop for police to be in and out and back on the street very quickly.
Mm-hmm. That's, and in terms of initiating emergency detentions, here in Wisconsin, it's initiated by law enforcement. How is it initiated at your end?
Yeah, so in Texas, 3 people can actually do the emergency detention. It's the police officer, it's a judge or magistrate, and that usually takes place at magistration. Maybe the prisoner or the individual said something where they were suicidal or homicidal, or their actions may be of concern for their mental health. Then the judge can sign the order and the officer would come and take them. Or a guardian or parent can also go to a facility and complete the emergency detention.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And this goes back to the self-care question. Are you seeing any trend in destigmatization of officers having mental illnesses and health illnesses?
That is such a huge barrier, and that's going to take time. There was a survey done of over 8,500 police officers by the Fraternal Order of Police, and they said that 92% of them still won't ask for help because of stigma. 87 won't ask for help because they're scared of a fit for duty, that they won't be allowed to go back to work. And 59% said that their EAP programs don't help them at all. So that's something, like what I said, we have to cultivate a culture of wellness within the police department in order to break down that stigma. And the way we do it is by talking about it, by normalizing it. Helen, if I said, if you were an officer and I said, hey, Helen, you want to go bowling with me on Thursday night? And you said, I wish I could, but I have to go to my therapist. Like, that should not shock my conscience. I should say, oh, okay, well, that's no problem. Maybe we'll go next week, right? So we have to normalize it by talking about it. And we're talking about it at our in-service training this year for 8 hours. Out of a 40-hour block of training, they're getting a wellness class. So it's good. And we've helped officers this year. Yeah.
Yeah, that would be great to see officers being able to access the help they need. There was a follow-up question. In the movie, there's the conversation that there's some changes in terms of surrendering weapons and accessibility to weapons. What does that look like now? How are you using gun locks and release of our weapons?
Yeah, now that policy is actually in place. We were implementing it during the film. It just hadn't been done yet. That's why there was confusion of, I'm doing it the way things have always been done, yet Joe's trying to draft this the way that the states laid out the mandates. And so what we finalized with was, of course, what the state mandated, and that was if an individual is homicidal or suicidal or mentally decompensated and has access to a weapon, readily accessible weapon, not something that's in a safe or something, but maybe it's on their nightstand and they're thinking, hey, I wanted to shoot myself. In fact, I got a gun right there. Then the officer would actually do a seizure of that weapon, put it in our property room. We have 14 days to send them a certified letter telling them that we will be checking within the next 30 days to see whether or not they were committed. And if they weren't, they will receive another letter saying they can come and get their firearm. Now, for an individual to actually get committed, it is such a small percentage in Texas, because for our police department, we average about 1,300 emergency detentions a month. That's a lot. If you have your weapon seized, the chance of you being actually committed, that's where a judge actually says, I'm committing you to the state hospital, for example, even if it's just one day, then they will not be able to have access to that firearm or purchase one in the future.
Mm-hmm.
The chances of that happening are less than 1%,
Mm-hmm.
less than 1%. So the
Wow.
majority of the weapons that we seize, the individuals are getting them back.
Mm-hmm. That's great. That sounds
You got
like
to
it's.
think we're in Texas, and everybody here, for your birthday, you're getting guns. I mean, it's ridiculous. How many guns are here in Texas, and no judge wants to do that. No doctor. It takes a psychiatrist as well, right, to recommend the stay at the state hospital, and then the judge has to rule on it. And right now, they just don't want. When you talk about weapons, it's a political nightmare that they don't want to get involved in.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, yeah. There's a lot of tension to be held there. Going back to the program that you said that you've been initiating through the COVID protocols of the 100, how can people learn more about that so they can bring that to their communities?
So the organization that put it together here is called STRAC. It's the South Texas Regional Advisory Council. What they did was they brought all the stakeholders to the table, all the hospitals and treatment facilities to the table. And this was about a 3-year discussion that we sat down and had. And what STRAC does is they control the air life traffic for the helicopters that have to land and pick you up maybe in the middle of nowhere and take you to a hospital, right? If it's a trauma one call. And it's an automatic acceptance on the hospital. So they had a system already online showing who had beds available on trauma one when they needed to do a transport. And they had the same thing program online with their EMS, so they knew where to transport patients. So what we asked was, is there a way to put all the mental health beds online as well? That way, when an officer has an ED, an emergency detention out in the field, can they call and say, direct me to the nearest bed?
Mm-hmm.
And the lights went off and said, my God, that's brilliant. Why didn't we do this before? Because now instead of taking an individual to maybe an emergency room where they don't really need to go, they actually need to go to a treatment facility. We're mapping the individual down the correct pathway for treatment. And the hospitals put forth the money to pay for the police officers, the paramedics, the clinicians. They hired a psychiatrist, gave us office space, bought us vehicles, computers. I mean, they poured a ton of money into this because what they realized was a lot of the people that were coming through the door were unfunded, and it was costing the hospitals a lot of money. The safety net system was really getting hit hard. So when we reduced the number of individuals going to the emergency room that were either unfunded or funded, it didn't matter. It was reducing costs for the hospital and allowing their staff, and especially during COVID right now, this was a huge home run because right now the hospitals are turning almost anybody away that's not COVID related, if it's not an emergency. So it was perfect timing. So and if anybody has any questions, they're welcome to contact me. I can put it up, I'm on Twitter or however you contact the movie. It doesn't matter. I'll be happy to explain the program in further detail.
Okay. Yeah, definitely. We've got 2 more questions. One is, do you have any recommended reading, or is there a place where people can find some good books on mental illness strategies for de-escalation, just kind of a broad range?
I could ask that question quite a bit. And I read, was it E. Torrey Fuller's book? Man, you put me on the spot. I'll look for it as we're talking. I'm going to multitask here, but really what it does is it talks about the history of the mental health, just the institutionalization, going into deinstitutionalization, what happened during that process, why was it such a major failure, and then are we doing the same thing we're doing now today, except using the state hospitals, we're actually using our jails, right, to be the largest state hospital facilities for the mentally ill. So it's that's one book you can read. Others, no, I mean, just educate yourself. You can Google topics, and that's kind of what I do just to keep up.
Yeah, I think Someone commented that the name of the book might be Surviving Schizophrenia. Does that sound?
That's one of them that he wrote, which now I'm going to have to read that. Yeah, I see it. Oh, here it is. It is called Out of the Shadows.
Out of the Shadows. Yeah.
I'll be able to sleep now tonight. Yeah, it's really good. I read it like 3 or 4 times because it also explains the Medicaid, Medicare process. And, you know, as a police officer, I had to learn everything about a mental health system, which is difficult, complicated, and convoluted. And I had to learn a way to talk. You know, when I walk into hospitals now, I can't sound like a cop anymore. You know, you know, these books and working with the clinicians were very helpful. You know, for sure.
Thank you. Well, as a final question, before we wrap up, just wanted to ask, how is your retirement planning coming?
So
is that on the horizon?
You're going to put me on the spot, aren't you? So an update. All right, Joe left the department. I don't know if anybody, it's out there in the universe, so you'll be able to find that out. He left a couple of months ago to start a business with Jesse, who was also in the film at the end. Right. I'm looking at a very near to come retirement date myself because I've also started a training company, and just the phone won't stop ringing right now. We're, you know, COVID's kind of a barricade for us, but you know, there's still people bringing us in and a lot of requests for podcasts and interviews and things. So it's getting difficult to do both. And as much as I love doing what I'm doing, I also love going out and helping departments set up programs, policies, and procedures. You know, to get, you know, it looks like we're just very successful here, but it took 17 years to get there, you know, to become this overnight success, right? So I'm hoping I can take everything I've learned from day one, go to other departments and say, look, none of this stuff over here worked for us, but this did, and really help them shortcut into getting, if they can't start a mental health unit, at least get the training, get a group of officers together that can be liaisons with different hospitals and treatment facilities, and really let the community know that, hey, we are engaged with you. We want to partner with you. You know, we want you to trust us that we're going to show up and do a good job. And we don't want you to be scared to call us for help, right? That's what we have to get past.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I feel like that's an excellent summary of the work that people in your field and in mental health supports is it took 17 years to be an overnight success. Like that just, it's a lot of effort. Thank you so much for your time.
Absolutely.
Thank you so much for the service that you do and for your upcoming success. That's all the time that we have. If you continue, for those of you that are still watching, if you have CIT, CIP related questions, you can email us at NAMI, Wisconsin. Thank you, Ernie, for your time. And if you have any questions, for those of you that are watching on becoming a NAMI member or making a donation, you can go to namiwisconsin.org. Thank you so much.
Parting thoughts. I'm sorry.
Oh, yep, parting thoughts. There's still 105 people. Go, do it.
I was a board member for NAMI San Antonio here, and I want to say thank you, you know, to everybody involved with NAMI. If it wasn't for NAMI, we wouldn't have a mental health unit here. They came to bat for us when we needed them the most. And this film was difficult to watch parts of it. So remember, you have a NAMI family that loves you and will support you and care for you. Sorry, I'm getting choked up here. Hold on, I'm going to get through this. I swear.
Thank you.
So they're there for you, and don't hesitate to use them. They are wonderful. So thank you, NAMI, for having me on. I appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you
You're
so
welcome.
much. And all of the comments, I mean, it's just blowing up. Thank you so much, Ernie, for your time, for the work you're doing for the future. And I hear what you're saying about NAMI. NAMI definitely came into my life at a time that I also needed it. So we're going to end the broadcast, and thank you all for coming.
You're welcome. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Yeah, I mean, that was the scene with Kendra on the bridge really wasn't all that long. I mean, maybe from the time we showed up until we talked her down, it was maybe 30 minutes. And so while people might think in a patrol capacity, like, oh my God, that's a long time, it really isn't. And I will say too, on the point of time, is that was our single biggest asset. I think what happens is, the mindset or the mentality of a lot of police officers is always speed of hurrying up, wrapping up, getting to the next thing. And we have this idea in our mind that if we take our time or if we spend a lot of time on a call, that somehow we're, hurting our fellow officers because we're not helping out with whatever. But I think if we all shifted that to truly, it's cliche, we've heard it, but the most important thing you're doing is the thing you're doing. It's not the next thing. And I'll tell you, the reason we were able to be so successful and not use force for over a decade, I mean, 11 years on the unit to not use force one time, was because we relied on time. We were patient. And I think when people just realize like, oh man, you're not going away. I can't antagonize you. I've said mean things to you. I've cursed you out. I've gotten your face. Like I've done everything I can short of like assaulting you. And you're just not budging. I guess you're not going to give up and they just end up giving in and you're really just waiting them out. And again, it really is about like, what's your mindset when you show up? And my mantra was always, every time I showed up on a call, I focused on the person, not the problem. And my goal was always connection over correction. And I know it's an iteration and it's fun, but it just is an easy way to remember that is people are people are people. They're not their problems. They're not their diagnoses. They're not their ailments. They're not their issues. Like they're people. And if you have that mentality and then you say, okay, what's my goal here? If your goal is to hurry up because you want to get to lunch or you're trying to wrap up so you can leave for the day, then that's going to come out in the way you interact. It's going to come out in the way that you communicate with people. And so if my goal is connection, well, that's going to take time, right? How often do you meet a brand new person for the first time ever and you trust them right away? Very, very, very rare. And so I know that, hey, this is going to take a little bit. I have to build rapport. I have to connect with them, share a little bit of myself. And it worked out well every time.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's true. It isn't often something that you just open your heart out on the first time you meet someone and go from, I don't know you to will you be in my wedding? That much harder would it be to make that connection if someone is in a mental illness crisis.
Right.
So in the video, you guys connect someone with child mental health services. What kind of supports are there? What kind of work is happening with supporting youth and children in mental illness crises?
So we actually, there's a lot of people are familiar with the crisis intervention training, the 40 hours. We actually use that and we have a CCIT. So we have a children's crisis intervention training, which is specific for school resource officers, school administrators, and the core classes are more focused on adolescent issues, and then our role players throughout the week are actually teenagers, and so we try and make it more specific to them. But we also, San Antonio is the 7th largest city in the country, and so we have decent resources here. We have a couple standalone inpatient private hospitals, that yes are for funded, but because of our collaborative efforts, they actually, one, we have state beds that are donated for the unfunded patients, but also part of our, we've created this system called the Navigator. Mm-hmm. And anytime police interact with someone with a mental illness and they have to transport them, all they have to do is call this one number 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. And all of the systems are online and the navigator can see all of these systems. It's not dispatch. It's like over the phone, not the radio. You call this number, you let them know who you have, their age, like where you're at, it's like a 3-minute call. And then they navigate you to the nearest appropriate facility based on that person's needs and based on capacity. Cause they're not going to route you to a facility that's already full or at capacity. And so then you get there and they're frustrated. The person has to wait longer to get their treatment. And so that's been a very successful program over the last couple of years as well. But a lot of it really is education. I would love to see mental health awareness or education, mental health first aid. I would love to see it mandatory in public education curriculum. I think, too often what happens is, people start to develop these issues very early on. They don't know how to deal with them. They don't know how to talk about them. And then they become adults. And just because they reach this age of 18 or 21, suddenly the expectation is, hey, you're an adult now, go figure it out. And that's when you're most susceptible to your biggest crises. And so I think if we really start to normalize all things mental health at a very early age throughout school, I think we would see a lot of changes, over time.
Yeah, I agree with that. There's a sense in which earlier exposure to that would help to destigmatize mental illness across the board and across all ages. Speaking of mandatory training, there's been some the CIT, CIP director here in Wisconsin, NAMI, Wisconsin. So I have a sense of what CIT is, and there's conversation about whether CIT should be required versus voluntary. And how has that worked in San Antonio?
Should be required. It's non-negotiable. Now, this is where I get into it with international CIT and SAM methodologies. So here's the thing,
You're
right?
being recorded, just so you know.
I know, that's okay. But I think it's super important. Until we live in a world where a police officer in this country can be dispatched to a call, and when they hear it, they say, nah, that one's not for me. I don't like that one. I'll take the next one. No, I'm not really good at that one either. I'll take the next one. We don't have that luxury. Police officers do not get to pick and choose what calls they go to. So they should not get to pick and choose their level of training for the calls they go to. Mm-hmm. And whatever numbers you look at, I've seen them as high as 50%. It's probably a little aggressive. I've seen them as low as 20% of all 911 calls in this country have a mental health component to them. If that's the case, you can't handle it with just 10 or 20% of your police agency trained. And here's the other point that we can speak about because this actually happened. So Chief McManus adopted that policy of, okay, let's just train 20% of our agency. We did that. No problem. They weren't even coming close to addressing the mental health call load that was coming in. And so we trained the community simultaneously, like, hey, ask for a CIT trained officer, ask for a CIT trained officer. Well, suddenly there's none available, and you would just get the next officer. And so then he said, you know what, let's just do 100%. And he was actually recognized for doing this, for being one of the major city police chiefs to do it. Now we do it in the academy for the cadets, and then they have to get it when they get out. But here's what we found out. When we mandate the training, first of all, police officers don't like anything mandated at all. But when we mandated it, when the chief mandated it, people showed up really upset about it. I mean, they were vocally not happy. Some of them said some very just ugly things about how they didn't believe in this. This is ridiculous. This isn't police work. They'd rather retire, all these things. But because of what mental illness is in this country, because we don't get it taught to us at a very early age, because we're so afraid of having these conversations, police officers, when given the choice to show up to a mental health training, are going to run away from that because it's going to make them vulnerable. It's going to make them feel things. And I like to say that emotions on cops are like dirty diapers. We work so hard to get out of it. No, I don't want to feel that. I don't want to deal with that. Get it off me. And those officers that were so aggressively against this training became our biggest advocates at the end. Now, the point to this is it has to be quality training. There has to be really because what we do in our training, it's officer-led, community supported. But, we say we're an overnight success that took 15 years to get there. But we've developed a program that has become nationally recognized. And the officers, it's almost impossible. I can count on one hand, honestly, and we've trained 2,000 just of SAPD, and then the thousands of officers I trained. I can count on one hand the amount of people that got through the week and they were like, nah, I don't get it. It wasn't for me. So we can absolutely create buy-in, and we can create behavior change because it's 40 hours. But you have to force it on them, because if you don't, they're going to stay away from it because it's uncomfortable. And what we also found too is that the ones who were most against it oftentimes were directly impacted by it. And they would come up and say hey, my wife suffers from, or I grew up with my mother being diagnosed with bipolar, and I'm just frustrated with everything and the lack of, but I didn't know this existed. I didn't know. And so then they start to kind of it like reinvigorates some hope in them. And so, yeah, a CIT training done well should be required. I think it should be now mandatory in all police training academies. I think it should be a big part of cadet training. And I know that's against what people believe too, is you have to have some experience before you do this. But what is law enforcement in 2020? You're interacting with people who are calling the police because things didn't go well.
Yeah.
Like, how should you not be trained? All CIT is learning how to effectively communicate with people and just having some awareness. So yeah, I am a very, very strong supporter, advocate for, if you're going to be a police officer, you have to have a minimum. Because again, you put me in charge, I'm going to say CIT training should be 120 hours, not 40. But
yeah, I mean, and you comment on that when you talk about 60 hours of training on your weapon versus the 8 hours. Certainly 40 hours is an improvement. And I've seen officers where the penny drops is on those role plays that we see in the video, where they're just interacting with the actors and really just using all of the skills that they're learning about during the week. That's such a crucial part. Speaking of policing in 2020, what are your thoughts on non-police, on responding to mental crises without police? So mental health units that don't have a police officer.
Yeah, I think it's okay to a point. Again, this is it's something that sounds relatively simple, but it's incredibly complex. I think to try and answer this as quickly and concisely as possible, I think, again, the problem is education. What's happening is we've lost the sense of neighboring one another. We've lost the sense of community in so many places. And so when we see something, this 9/11 started this see something, say something. And so what people are doing is, as soon as they see someone who's symptomatic of their mental illness, they're like, oh, I don't know what that is. Let me call the police. And they're calling police oftentimes who don't have basic training, like the basic understanding of what mental illness is. So now this concerned citizen is calling an untrained person to show up who has authority, who knows the use of force continuum, who knows the law, to handle this call. And then when it goes wrong, people are like, well, that was terrible. Why would you handle it that way? And my rebuttal to that is always, well, why did you call the police? Like, what did you expect to happen? Because the unfair expectation is that if you're a police officer in this country, you're a master of all things. And we know that that's not realistic. And the problem is that there's a lot of officers who also buy into that mentality, and then it stresses the heck out of them. And so then they're freaking out on every call because they're trying to like wear all these hats and pretend that they know all the things, and they're faking their way through everything. And that takes a toll on you. And they're absolutely stressed. They're completely overwhelmed. They're incredibly depressed because they start to realize, as they develop moral injury over time, it's like, oh God, like what have I gotten myself into? But I'm going to keep forging on. And then we wonder why our rates of suicide is so high. We wonder why our rates of substance abuse and divorce and all these issues are so high. It's because we've been sold a lie. We've been sold this lie that being a police officer in this country requires depersonalization. I've never liked that. I think if you're going to be a good police officer in this country, you have to be able to personalize those interactions. You have to be able to humanize the badge. This idea that we have a switch that you can just turn off when you go to work and then turn it on when you get home is so unrealistic. And so I think the best approach is going to be a hybrid approach until we can educate the entire country to say, hey, people who have a mental illness are not inherently dangerous. It's okay if you walk up to them and say, hey, you look upset, or you look scared, or you look nervous. Is everything okay? I want to help you. And you don't involve police. That would be great, but we're not there yet. We're so far from that. We're so far removed from that. And so I think the best thing to do is say, who are the first responders? Because when people see a problem, they call 911. They don't look up Google to find out, like, where's a mobile crisis team I can call? They're going to go right to 911. And so I think having your mobile crisis teams, your Cahoots, all these models that are out there attached to the police department, I think that's probably going to be the most effective right now solution until we figure out how we can educate the entire country.
Yeah, it is definitely something to be considered. And hopefully with the passing of the 988 number that'll go into effect in about 2 years, and people will be able to associate mental health crisis calls with 988 and not 911. And so hopefully that would shift those kinds of supports. In the movie, you talk about how you have to retrain your brain to go from like thinking about the gun all the time. Like, how do you actually retrain your brain from the hours and hours of training that you get, that now this 40-hour training is meant to sort of
Yeah,
change?
that's great. And so it took me about 2 years of being a police officer. So I wasn't on the unit yet. I was still on patrol, but after about 2 years of doing the job, there was just this moment where I was like, wait a minute. And this is what I challenge every first responder with, but I say, challenge the BS, which is your belief system. And if you can accept the fact that when you were in training, a lot of the training was focused on this fear. It's like this fear tactic of you're going to get ambushed. You got to sit with your back to the wall at restaurants. You're going to die. You're going to die. And it's so sad. But, you know, in our academy, which is 7.5 months long, we would show up to a report writing class. Like, this is just a class on how to write a police report. And they would start it with like a video of an ambush on some cop just getting shot in the face and killed. And you're like, God. And this is just over and over and over. And so then you graduate and you're terrified. And I just, as a metaphor, I like to say, you know, in most police academies in this country right now, you know, or not right now, but for decades, it's like there's a 55-gallon drum of just paranoia, and they're just injecting everyone throughout their training. And then they graduate and they're going to put on a show, because we're taught not to be afraid. We're taught, like, don't show fear. We're taught all these things. But it took me about 2 years to realize, like, okay, what's actually happening here? So many of these calls are the same thing. You know, they're different faces. It's the same story. They're usually, because I worked overnight shifts, so it's usually tied to some type of alcohol, which is a behavioral issue, drugs, which is a behavioral issue, some type of disturbance or domestic violence. And it was just people who were in some level of like crisis, trying to like figure out their lives, and there was some level of suffering. And so then I'm like, well, like, what are we really doing out here? You know? And for me, and then I became like, they would, you know, anytime there was a suicidal person, they'd be like, hey, Smaro, you want to come over here and like sit down and talk to this girl? She's got a knife. She's talking about killing herself. Like, I know you like to come sit with people. And it's like, yeah, absolutely. And it was kind of like, I would be made fun of a little bit for it, but I was like, yeah, I love that. That's my reputation. Right. So then when the unit started in 2008, I put in for it and I got in right away. And I never would have saw myself doing anything else, because for me, it was such a unique way of policing. Not that I saw mental health as a criminal issue, but I just saw it as like, hey, if this is the way it is, I'm so grateful because of my own story, my own trauma, that like by the grace of God or whatever you believe in, I'm on this side of the 911 call. And I think that perspective is so important, because I've made terrible choices in my life. I've made terrible mistakes in my life, but luckily my vices were never drugs or alcohol, where I lost my job, my career, my money, my home, and all that. But I've certainly made my own poor choices. And so I show up with gratitude every day of, at least I'm on this side of it, getting to help people get through their side of it. And then understanding too, ACEs, you know, adverse childhood experiences, and how that plays a role in policing. And there's so many police officers that don't know what that is, have never been through the training, don't know their own ACE score and how that impacts them. And so I think, again, it's a very complex issue that we make it like, when you look at it from 30,000 feet, it's like, oh geez, how can we ever tackle that? But if you break it down to like an individual responsibility, it really can be that simple. And I think, you know, there's a contagion, just like fear is contagious. So is joy. So is, you know, wellness. So is all this other stuff. And as we start to do things right or well, and then we advocate for ourselves, it starts to ripple effect out, and we can do things in a positive way. Because again, a big reason why I left was for my own mental health, but it was also because I see a massive problem in this country with the way police officers are being recruited, the way they're being vetted, the way they're being trained, and then the way they're not being supported once they're out full time. And there was a great study done out of Columbia by Dr. John Mann, and they found that it was a longitudinal study. Over 20 years in this country, an average police officer will respond to 188 traumatic events, and most of them will never, ever, ever go to therapy. And so, like, where do you think that goes? Right. And so I think that there's a lot that needs to happen to address these issues for sure.
Mm-hmm. Thank you so much. And thank you for the transparency and vulnerability that you share about your story in the movie. And just as you referenced, actually, when we were learning more about the movie, we learned that this actually marks the 1-year anniversary of the release. of the movie. And I'm just wondering, you've alluded to leaving the department. What else is different in the last year?
It's funny. I got a random text this morning, a number I didn't have saved, and they said, super exciting. Congratulations. I hope you have an awesome day. Really looking forward to tonight. And I was like, sorry, I don't know who this is. And they're like, the HBO, like the premieres tonight. And I was like, wow. Like, I know 2020 has been a disaster, but you are 1 year off. So it came out November 19 of last year. But yeah, so what's different for me in the last year is I voluntarily left after 15 years of service with the department in September. I started a business back in 2017. Doing exactly what I do, leveraging my skill sets and what I've learned in a large city to help out. You know, our niche is in smaller rural areas that don't have the same resources or access to care. And so we would go in and they don't have the budgets to train their police officers. And so, you know, we got creative. We would partner with the local mental health authorities and we basically bring our concept into other areas. And so, I left in September with Jesse, who's also in that film. So we were in the Marine Corps together, and he's been my best friend for 20 years. And so he's my business partner. We both left, and we're doing this full time now where it got so busy for us from September to February of people reaching out and booking us for these 40-hour schools. And not just that, but we have hospitals reaching out to us to train their staff, their nurses and doctors. And we have even treatment providers having us come out and do 2-day or 3-day trainings for their clinicians, their crisis intervention specialists. So it really is, it's been great for us because I feel like I can now like do what I love to do on a larger scale, and I can help and impact more people and not just in my own agency. And so it's been really, really rewarding for us. And again, I think it's one of those things where it's like I found my purpose, and I really do love what I get to do, and I'm very blessed to do that. And so, yeah, I mean, that's the only thing really that's different is I took a leap of faith, I'm scared out of my mind. I don't know what I'm doing. I'm trying to build this plane as I fly it, but it's been good so far.
Yeah, well, and it's great to see such a commitment from the community, from health providers, from schools to recognize this is CIT and CIP is definitely an expanding program here in Wisconsin as well. As someone pointed out from your TED Talk in our Q&A, the expression I see you is derived from one of the African languages and borrowed on Avatar. I just kind of want to end with that, with those words of thank you and I see you.
Yeah, it's Zulu, I think. And I knew it this, oh man, I forgot it's a beautiful word too. I can't remember what it is now, but yeah, I agree. Yeah, I love it. It's an important phrase for me. And again, I think we are so addicted to distraction in our society. And so if we spent more time, again, focusing on connection, remembering why we're doing what we're doing, and it would maximize the human experience for sure.
Mm-hmm. So thank you so much, Joe.
Yeah, thank you.